The $1 million contract was resting on top of a milk cooler nobody had wanted at auction. Its compressor had been dead for 4 years. A long dent ran down the left side, and the faded stainless steel still carried the shadow of the old Hale dairy label. Standing around it were a food distributor from Ohio, a sanitation specialist, 2 county officials, several local farmers, and Martin Voss, the banker who had once joked that the cooler might be the only piece of farming Caleb Hale could still afford. Outside the garage, 2 refrigerated trucks waited with their engines running. Inside, rows of oyster and shiitake mushrooms filled the damp air with the clean smell of hardwood, stuff, and cool earth. Eleanor Shaw, purchasing director for North River Specialty Foods, rested one hand on the contract. The minimum purchase value printed on the final page was $1. Ling Ba Yi. Ling Ba Ling. But she had not signed it. If one production room fails tonight, she asked, how much can you still deliver next week? Caleb opened a black production ledger. He did not look at Martin. 812 pounds without that room. He said, 940 if the garage backup cycle holds. And if the backup does not hold, 706. When would you tell me? Before 5 tomorrow morning. Eleanor studied him. Most growers she visited spoke first about what they hoped to produce. Caleb answered with what he could still deliver after something failed. She looked down at the old cooler. 4 years earlier, Ridge County Bank had taken Caleb's father's fields, barns, farmhouse, livestock, and machinery. The bank had left him one concrete block garage because it stood on a separate parcel that had never been included in the mortgage. At the time, Martin Voss had treated that detail as almost meaningless. Now, the largest agreement in the history of Hale Ridge mushrooms was waiting to be signed on top of the one piece of equipment everyone had called worthless. But Eleanor Shaw had not driven more than 200 miles because Caleb's mushrooms were rare. She had driven that far because 4 other growers had failed a test Caleb had spent years preparing for, and 12 hours before her inspection, his entire operation had nearly failed it too. In October of 1992, the Hale farm looked much as it had when Caleb was a boy. The white farmhouse stood beneath 2 old maples. The dairy barn leaned slightly toward the east pasture. A rusted windmill still turned whenever the weather rolled down from the hills outside Kittening, Pennsylvania. But yellow inventory tags hung from the machinery. A foreclosure notice had been nailed beside the kitchen door. 3 men from Ridge County Bank were walking through the property with clipboards. The farm covered 142 acres. Caleb's grandfather had purchased the first 40 with money saved from mill work. Caleb's father, Thomas Hale, had expanded the dairy herd and borrowed against the land in 1972. The original loan had been $78. Ling ling ling. Over the next 20 years, it had been restructured after a flood damaged the lower barn. Milk prices fell. 2 feed crops failed. And Thomas developed health problems. The family had not ignored the debt. They had paid for years. They had sold cattle. They had delayed repairs. Thomas had refinanced equipment and worked through illnesses that should have kept him in bed. But the debt remained. By the time Thomas died, the balloon note stood at $137. C-Bay. Caleb was 28. He had spent most of his adult life repairing machinery, milking cows, and helping his father keep the farm alive. He had no college degree. He had no investor. After the cows were sold, he had no income large enough to refinance the note. Martin Voss met him beside the machine shed. Martin was 47, carefully dressed, and calm in the way men often were when the consequences belonged to someone else. His father had approved the Hale family's first major loan. Martin had known Caleb since Caleb was young enough to fall asleep beneath a desk during meetings. That history did not stop the foreclosure. The bank will take possession of the farmhouse, barns, secured equipment, and the mortgaged acreage, Martin said. Caleb looked past him toward a small concrete block garage near the end of the lane. It sat beyond an old fence line on a patch of ground. His grandmother had transferred directly to him in 1989. What about the garage? Martin opened the parcel map. The building stood on a separate 0.62-acre lot. It had never been added to the farm mortgage. Martin checked the legal description twice. The bank has no claim on that parcel. Caleb nodded. He did not accuse Martin of stealing. The loan documents were real. The missed payments were real. The foreclosure was legal. But legality did not make it easier to watch strangers place numbered tags on his father's tools. That evening, Caleb walked through the dairy barn alone. The stalls were empty. A loose chain tapped against a steel post. In the small office, he found his father's production ledger. Thomas Hale had recorded nearly everything. Daily milk yield, feed deliveries, veterinary costs, pump failures, cases of mastitis, hours of labor, the days when the bulk tank ran too warm, even the evenings when he had been too sick to finish milking. Caleb closed the book and carried it to the garage. By sunset, the bank controlled the farmhouse, the barn, the fields, and nearly every machine that had once made Hale Farm a working operation. Caleb owned one garage, an old pickup, his personal tools, Armaywin, 300 inches savings, and a ledger full of numbers from a farm that no longer belonged to him. The auction was held 3 weeks later. Farmers stood in the cold with paper cups of coffee, while an auctioneer sold 40 years of Hale family work in less than 6 hours. The tractors went first, then the hay equipment, then feeders, gates, shop tools, and dairy equipment. Caleb watched a neighboring dairyman buy the manure spreader his father had rebuilt twice. He watched a machinery dealer purchase the baler. He said nothing. Near the end of the sale, the auctioneer pointed toward an old 400-gallon stainless steel milk cooler. Its compressor was dead. One leg had been welded. The lid no longer sealed properly. Who will give me 200? Nobody moved. 100? Silence. 50? Caleb raised his hand. A scrap dealer offered 60. Caleb bid 65. The dealer shrugged. Sold. $65. Martin watched Caleb load the cooler onto a borrowed trailer. That may be the only piece of farming he can still afford, he said. A few men laughed. Not loudly. That made it worse. Caleb tightened the straps. Martin stepped closer. You understand that keeping old equipment will not reverse the foreclosure. I bought a tank. You bought a broken milk cooler? Caleb looked at the stainless steel. It still holds water. He drove it to the garage. He did not yet have cows, milk, or a business plan large enough to justify spending $65, but the cooler was made of heavy stainless steel. It could be cleaned. It could be heated. And it was one of the last objects on Earth that still carried the smell of his father's farm. Caleb first read about specialty mushrooms in an agricultural magazine left in the break room of the repair shop where he had begun working nights. The article described small growers supplying oyster and shiitake mushrooms to restaurants. The operations did not require hundreds of acres. They required controlled temperature, humidity, cleanliness. Reliable spawn, careful scheduling, and buyers who valued consistency. Caleb read the article 3 times. Then he called a spawn supplier in Ohio. The man on the phone did not promise easy money. He explained that mushrooms could create high value in a small space, but contamination could destroy a crop before a beginning grower understood what had gone wrong. Caleb ordered a small amount of oyster mushroom spawn. Inside the garage, he built shelves from discarded angle iron. He lined one corner with plastic sheeting. He installed a used humidifier, cut ventilation openings, and mounted 2 salvaged fans. Then he turned the old milk cooler into a crude pasteurization tank for chopped straw. The first test bags produced clusters of pale oyster mushrooms. They were uneven. They were not enough to sell, but they grew. For the first time since the foreclosure, Caleb looked at something living and thought it might become a crop. Martin saw the bags a month later. He had come to confirm the boundary between the bank's property and Caleb's parcel. When Caleb opened the garage door, varm, damp air rolled into the winter morning. Dozens of plastic bags sat on shelves. White mycelium spread through the straw. Martin stared at them. "What is this?" "Oyster mushrooms." Martin touched one bag with the end of his pen. "You lost a dairy farm and replaced it with wet feed sacks." Two county employees behind him smiled. Caleb closed the notebook in his hand. Martin looked around. "You understand that a hobby does not become agriculture because you put it in a building. This is not a farm building." "No," Martin said. "I suppose it is not." By the end of the week, people at the feed store were calling it the fungus garage. Some were curious. Most expected the smell, electricity bill, or first serious contamination problem to end the project before spring. Caleb's first commercial batch contained 480 bags. He had calculated the expected yield. He had spoken with 2 restaurant owners. He had purchased more spawn than he could comfortably afford. For 3 weeks, the garage appeared to be working. Then green patches appeared inside 6 bags. The next morning, Caleb removed 23. Within 4 days, green mold was spreading across the shelves. Some bags never colonized. Others turned sour. A few produced mushrooms, but not enough to fill the promised orders. Caleb carried contaminated bags outside one by one. By the time he finished, 278 were gone. One restaurant canceled after he failed to deliver the promised volume. Another accepted only 12 pounds. The losses were worse than the sight. Spawn, stuff, electricity, packaging, fuel, and unsold product brought the cost of the failed cycle to approximately $4. Sanbei. Caleb had started with only $2. 300 inches savings. The difference came from night shifts at the repair shop and money he had intended to use for winter heat. The milk cooler had not heated the straw evenly. The garage had no true clean zone. Caleb had walked between raw material and inoculation areas in the same boots. He had opened bags too often. He had expanded the batch before proving the process. At the feed store, a man asked whether the mushrooms had made him rich, yet another said the ruined bags might still make decent compost. Martin looked at the returned produce crates in Caleb's truck. "Even mold has to be sold before it becomes a business," he said. This time several men laughed. Martin's words hurt because the failed crop was real. Caleb drove home without answering. That night he stood behind the garage beside a trench filled with ruined straw bags. Steam rose from the pile. For the first time, he considered stopping. Not because Martin had mocked him, because the evidence appeared to agree with Martin. Caleb went inside to find the electric bill. His father's ledger sat beneath a stack of invoices. He opened it. Thomas Hale's handwriting filled the pages in narrow blue lines. One page compared milk production, before and after a feed change. Another tracked machine downtime. A third recorded veterinary costs by month. Caleb had always thought of the ledger as proof of how hard his father had tried. That night, he noticed something else. Thomas had not only recorded what happened, he had tried to record why. Near the middle of the book, one sentence had been underlined twice. "What you don't measure will eventually own you." Caleb sat down. His mushroom notebook contained daily temperatures and estimated yields, but it did not identify which straw came from which load. It did not record how long each section had remained inside the cooler. It did not separate contamination by shelf, tool, spawn lot, or work period. He had measured the result. He had not measured the process. The next morning, he wrote across the top of the failed batch page, "Failure source unknown. Do not repeat until known." He did not begin another 480 bag cycle. He started with 40. A spawn supplier gave Caleb the name of Ruth Keller. Ruth was 64 and had spent nearly 3 decades managing sanitation at a commercial spawn laboratory in Chester County. She agreed to visit the garage for fuel, money, and lunch. She arrived wearing rubber boots and carrying a flashlight. She examined the shelves, traced the airflow with a strip of tissue, and watched Caleb wash his hands. Then she pointed at the floor. "You walked through the straw area and into the clean corner in the same boots." Caleb looked down. Ruth pointed toward the ventilation opening. "Your intake air crosses the packing table." She lifted a bag. What lot is this spawn from? Caleb searched through his invoices. I have the receipt. That is not what I asked. She selected another bag. When was this straw pasteurized? About 2 weeks ago. About? Caleb had no better answer. Ruth returned the bag to the shelf. You have mushrooms, she said. You do not have a system. Caleb looked around the garage. What would you change first? Your size. I need more production. You need fewer ways to fail. Ruth told him to remove 1/3 of the shelving. The change reduced immediate production, but it created space for a separate inoculation area, a clean walkway, and proper isolation. Caleb followed her advice. He painted tool handles by zone. Red tools remained in the raw straw area. Blue tools stayed near inoculation. White tools were used only for harvest and packing. He bought separate boots. He installed barriers. He placed temperature probes at 3 depths inside the cooler. He assigned a code to every batch. Spawn lot, straw source, pasteurization time, inoculation date, shelf location, harvest weight, contamination result. Ruth returned 6 weeks later. The garage held fewer bags, but each bag had a history. That is better, she said. Is it good? No. Caleb waited. Ruth looked through the records, but now you might learn why. For the next 14 months, Caleb's operation grew slowly. Some weeks it did not grow at all. He worked from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning at the repair shop. He slept for 4 hours, then checked temperatures, misting cycles, and contamination before sunrise. He tested different straw lengths. He measured pasteurization at several points. He recorded which shelves dried fastest. He changed the direction of airflow. He stopped buying from one supplier after 3-week batches. He learned that a beautiful first flush could hide poor total yield. He learned that more humidity was not always better. He learned that one contaminated bag removed early could save an entire shelf. One morning, Caleb found 12 bags producing clean, white oyster clusters. They looked better than anything he had grown. The caps were even, the stems were short, the weight was promising. He began preparing them for harvest. Ruth arrived before he finished. She walked past the mushrooms and pointed toward a thin discoloration around the filter patch on one bag. What tool did you use here? The blue knife. Where was it before that? Caleb thought for a moment. The trimming table. Which zone? He looked toward the colored handles. The trimming table belonged to the harvest area. The knife should never have entered the inoculation space. The mushrooms looked healthy. There was no visible green mold. Caleb had an order due the following morning. Ruth did not tell him what to do. She only asked, "Can you prove those bags stayed inside your clean process?" "No." "Then what are they?" Caleb looked at the clusters. Unverified. He destroyed all 12 bags. The order had to be reduced. The restaurant owner was unhappy. Caleb lost money on the delivery. But after that day, every tool transfer was recorded. His contamination numbers changed. The first major cycle had lost 58% of the bags. A later batch lost 31%. Then 17. Then 9. Eventually, the rate remained below 4% for 3 consecutive months. Caleb wrote down every number. Not only the good ones, especially the bad ones. The old milk cooler became more precise. He installed calibrated probes and a manual valve system. It remained slower than commercial equipment. But Caleb understood every part of it. If a sensor failed, he could use thermometers. If a pump stopped, he could circulate water manually. If electricity failed, he knew how long the heat would remain within range. The garage still looked unimpressive from the county road. The roof was patched. The gravel lot turned muddy in spring. No polished sign hung above the door. But every bag had a code. Every tool had a place. Every failure left a record. The first steady customer was a chef named Luis Ortega. Luis operated a small restaurant outside Pittsburgh. He did not care that Caleb had lost his land. He did not care that the mushrooms came from a garage. He cared about consistency. He held one oyster mushroom cluster beneath the kitchen light. "Can you bring me 35 pounds like this every Thursday?" "Yes." Not 31 week and 46 the next. 35. Same size. I can sort for that. No substitutions without calling. Caleb nodded. If you cannot deliver, I call before you plan the menu. Luis placed the mushroom on the counter. Thursday morning. Before 10. The first delivery arrived at 9:12. The second at 9:07. The third at 9:18. On the fourth Thursday, Caleb loaded 35 pounds into insulated crates and turned the key in his pickup. The starter clicked once. Then nothing. It was 7:14. Luis was serving a private luncheon at noon. Caleb had less than 3 hours to travel nearly 50 miles. He opened the hood and tested the battery. The battery was good. The starter solenoid was not. Caleb could repair it, but not quickly enough to guarantee the delivery. He carried the crates back into the cool room, called Luis, and told him the truck had failed. Luis was silent. Can you deliver? Yes. How? I will call again when I know. Caleb contacted a neighboring mechanic named Warren Pike. Warren had laughed at the fungus garage during its first winter. He listened to Caleb's request. You want to borrow my van for mushrooms? For one delivery. Warren looked at the muddy insulated crates. What happens if they smell up the van? I clean it. What happens if you damage it? I repair it. Warren tossed him the keys. Bring it back with fuel. Caleb transferred the crates, packed extra ice around them, and arrived at Luis's kitchen at 9:46. Luis checked the temperature. Then he looked at Caleb. You called before I had to call you. Yes. You still delivered? Yes. Luis signed the receipt. Next week. Bring 60 pounds. Caleb kept every signed receipt. The orders did not make him wealthy. But for the first time, the mushroom operation paid its own electricity, spawn, packaging, and fuel. One Thursday. Luis handed him a check. These are better than the shipment I used to get from New York. Caleb looked at the amount. It was not a fortune. It was proof. Martin saw him at the feed store in the spring of 1994. 2 produce crates sat in the back of Caleb's pickup. Each carried a handwritten label. Hale Ridge Mushrooms. Martin read the name. Ridge? The garage sits above the East Ridge. How much do you sell? Enough to come back next week. A few men at the counter listened. Martin smiled faintly. Selling a few boxes does not make a garage, a farm. Caleb signed a receipt for packaging supplies. Martin continued. A farmer owns ground. Caleb folded the receipt. A farmer delivers what he promised. Nobody laughed. Martin's expression shifted. You should consider selling the garage while the parcel still has value. It is producing. A building can produce expenses too. Caleb lifted the crates. Martin looked toward the truck. There is no shame in admitting a garage cannot become a farm. Caleb opened the door. No. He placed the crates inside. But there is a cost to admitting something before the records say it. But 1995. Caleb had 14 regular customers. The garage produced between 310 and 340 pounds a week. His records showed no order more than 1 day late in 11 months. But the building had reached its limit. More shelving would restrict airflow. More bags would increase contamination risk. Caleb located an abandoned poultry hatchery 6 miles away. The building covered 400 square feet, and had drains, washable walls, and enough electrical capacity for climate control equipment. The owner agreed to lease it. But Caleb needed county approval. He attended the agricultural board meeting, carrying binders full of records. Martin sat on the board. Caleb presented projected yield, sanitation zone, water use, delivery routes, waste handling, and a staged expansion plan. The chairman asked practical questions. Caleb answered each one. Then Martin leaned forward. These production estimates are aggressive. They are based on 18 months of records. In a garage. Yes. A larger operation may not behave the same way. That is why the first stage uses 40% of the building. Martin turned toward the board. This county has seen emotional business plans built around family history. Caleb remained still. Martin continued. His father spent 20 years refusing to admit that the Hale farm no longer worked. Caleb is doing the same thing in a smaller building. The room went quiet. Caleb's hand tightened around his pencil. Martin looked at the binders. You are asking us to approve projections built on a garage operation and a family name. Caleb waited until he finished. Which number is wrong? Martin paused. The market may not support the expansion. Which customer letter do you believe is false? I did not say false. Which yield figure? Martin looked down. The risk is larger than these pages suggest. Caleb nodded. Then put the risk in the record. The board approved the permit with conditions. Caleb walked outside carrying his binders. He had won the permit. But Martin's words followed him into the parking lot. His father had died believing he had failed to save the farm. Now that failure had been used as evidence that Caleb could not build anything new. For the first time, Caleb wanted to return to the meeting room and say everything he had kept quiet for 3 years. He did not. He drove back to the garage and checked the evening temperature logs. In February of 1996, a fire damaged a commercial mushroom facility supplying North River Specialty Foods. North River distributed specialty produce to 46 restaurants, hotels, and professional kitchens. The damaged facility was expected to remain closed for at least 8 months. A backup supplier offered to fill the gap, but could not connect finished crates to individual spawn lots and production rooms. Eleanor Shaw had 90 days to find a replacement network. She inspected 4 growers closer to Columbus. One had enough mushrooms but no reliable contamination records. One mixed products from several farms under one label. One had no backup cold storage. One could not guarantee minimum weekly volume. Luis Ortega sent Eleanor copies of Caleb's delivery records. She called the garage at 6:40 on a Tuesday morning. Caleb answered on the second ring. Caleb Hale? Yes. This is Eleanor Shaw with North River Specialty Foods. Chef Ortega gave me your number. Caleb picked up a pencil. What do you need? There was a brief silence. Most growers began by describing what they sold. Caleb had asked what she needed. Oyster and shiitake mushrooms. Weekly delivery. Consistent grades. Full lot traceability. What volume? Eventually. More than you produce. How much? 1,050 pounds a week. Caleb looked through the window. 328 pounds were scheduled for harvest. When do you need it? 90 days. What happened to your supplier? Fire. Was the crop contaminated? No. Is the facility closed? Yes. Do you require a second production site? I require a documented backup process. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. At the end, Eleanor asked, what was your contamination rate last quarter? 3.8%. Estimated? Recorded. Can you send the batch sheets? Yes. All of them? Yes. That afternoon, Caleb mailed records dating back nearly 4 years. Eleanor later told him that was why she continued the conversation. Not because 8% was perfect. Because the records also showed the period when contamination had reached 58%. North River sent a written list of requirements. Caleb would have to increase production from approximately 330 pounds a week to 1. Ling Wu Ling. Contamination had to remain below 5%. On-time delivery had to stay above 96%. Every crate required lot traceability. He needed a documented response if one room failed. He needed backup pasteurization and enough working capital to survive the production lag. The new facility also had to pass an inspection. Caleb called Eleanor. I cannot reach the full number inside the garage. I know. I have a permitted building. I saw the plan. The equipment will cost more than I have. North River may provide an advance against future deliveries. How much? Up to $72,000. What happens if I fail inspection? You repay the unearned amount? What secures it? The equipment purchased with the advance. Not your garage. Eleanor paused. This is not $1 million contract. Mr. Hale, I understand. This is the chance to prove you can carry one. Caleb opened a metal cash box. Inside were notes for a different plan. Over 4 years, he had saved $31. Ling Ling Ling. A 17-acre parcel at the edge of the old Hale farm was scheduled for auction. It included part of the orchard his father had cared for, Caleb had hoped to buy it. He could use the money for land, or he could use it to build production capacity for a contract he had not yet earned. He spent 3 nights reviewing the figures: lease obligations, equipment resale value, utility costs, production lag, worst case repayment. He did not make the decision because Martin had insulted him. He made it because nearly 4 years of records showed the process could scale if airflow, clean zones, and production scheduling were designed properly. Caleb signed the hatchery lease. He committed the savings. He sold the 1,966 Ford F-100 his father had restored, adding $8,700 to the expansion fund. On the morning of the land auction, Caleb stood inside the unfinished hatchery while workers installed drainage pipe. The telephone rang. It was the auction clerk. "Your bidder number is still active," the man said. "The orchard parcel is coming up. Do you want me to bid?" Caleb looked at 3 envelopes on a folding table. Isron. Spawn. Payroll. The money in the account was not enough to cover the expansion and purchase the land. He looked through the open loading door toward the hills, where the old Hale farm lay beyond view. "No," he said. "You sure?" Caleb watched one of his workers measure a floor drain. "Let it go." That afternoon, an investment group purchased the 17 acres. A refrigeration unit arrived at the hatchery less than an hour later. Caleb watched the truck back into position. He had not lost the orchard a second time. He had chosen something else. That did not make the cost smaller. The new facility did not immediately improve the business. The first shelving layout restricted airflow near the north wall. A humidity line leaked. A used refrigeration unit shut down twice. 2 employees treated sanitation rules as suggestions. Caleb dismissed one after the man crossed from a raw material area into inoculation without changing protective clothing. The other quit during the 3rd week. Production increased, but labor costs rose faster. One Friday, Caleb placed the rent, spawn, and payroll envelopes on a table. There was enough money for only 2. He paid the workers. Then he used the following week's garage deliveries to purchase spawn. The rent was paid 6 days late. During week 6, the combined garage and hatchery operation produced 620 pounds. It was progress, but far below North River's target. During week 9, the production reached 846 pounds. A faulty humidifier caused uneven caps in one room, and nearly 70 pounds failed. The grade requirement, Caleb did not include them in projected contract capacity. During week 11, the operation harvested 1,074 pounds. For the first time, the total exceeded the target, but contamination in room 3 reached 5.6%. Caleb isolated the room and reported the result to Eleanor. He could produce the volume. He had not yet proved he could produce it consistently. Martin heard about the delays. At a county breakfast, someone asked whether Caleb had received the large contract. Martin answered before Caleb could. "There is no contract. There is an inspection." The distinction was correct. The tone was not. Another farmer asked whether Caleb had risked his savings for nothing. Caleb answered honestly, "It is possible." The room grew quiet. Martin looked surprised. Caleb continued, "That is why I kept the garage." The original operation remained active as the backup site. Culture work stayed there. Small test batches stayed there. The old milk cooler remained ready for manual pasteurization. Caleb did not hide expansion problems from Eleanor. He sent weekly reports. When airflow produced uneven growth, he reported it. When contamination rose, he isolated the affected production and lowered his forecast. Eleanor did not praise him. She asked harder questions. The inspection was scheduled for Monday morning. At 10:16 Sunday night, an alarm sounded. The exhaust fan in production room 2 had stopped. Caleb checked the control panel. A relay had burned. Without ventilation, carbon dioxide began to rise. Temperature followed. The room contained 180 fruiting blocks and nearly 260 pounds of expected harvest. Caleb could reset the system, move the best-looking blocks into another room, and hope the crop appeared acceptable during inspection. but moving the blocks could spread contamination. The room's recorded conditions were already outside specification. Then the power flickered. A storm had damaged a line farther up the road. The facility's backup generator started, but the fuel gauge showed less than half a tank. Caleb calculated the electrical load. There was not enough fuel to operate the cold room and full fruiting room ventilation through the night. The cold room contained product already harvested and promised to existing customers. The fruiting rooms contained future production. If Caleb protected the fruiting crop, the harvested mushrooms might warm beyond specification. If he protected the cold room, part of the future crop could be lost. One of the workers looked at him. "We can keep room 2 alive if we shut down cold storage." Caleb checked the cold room temperature. "That product leaves tomorrow. We could replace it from the next harvest. We already promised this one." He directed generator power to the cold room. Non-essential systems were shut down. Room 2 remained isolated. Conditions in part of the unfinished crop began to drift. "Adzeche, patruzechi." Caleb called Eleanor. She answered after 3 rings. "Shaw. This is Caleb Hale. What happened? Room 2 exhaust failed. We also lost utility power. The generator cannot carry cold storage and full fruiting ventilation. What did you prioritize?" "Cold storage." "Why?" "That product is already promised." "What is the crop impact?" "Unknown." "Room 2 is removed from capacity. Can you still run the inspection?" "Yes." "Will you meet full weekly volume without it?" "No." Silence followed. Caleb looked through the glass at the affected room. Eleanor said, "Do not clean the failure up for me." "What do you mean?" "Leave the logs. Leave the room isolated. Show me what happens when the plan breaks." She ended the call. Caleb worked through the night. He did not move the affected crop. He did not alter the logs. At 4:30 inches the morning, he calculated the remaining capacity, 812 pounds. Without room 2, 940. If the garage backup system completed additional cycles, still below the final contract level. At sunrise, Martin arrived with 2 county officials participating in the agricultural enterprise tour. He saw Caleb's truck outside. "You look tired. Room failure." "Today?" "Yes." Martin looked toward the building. "Unfortunate timing." Caleb unlocked the door. "Failure usually is." Eleanor arrived at 7:50 with a food safety specialist named Mark Feld. She did not ask to see the best room. "Show me room 2. A red isolation notice hung on the door. Inside, several mushroom clusters had stretched under high carbon dioxide. Some caps were malformed. Condensation covered one corner. Caleb opened the failure log. "Alarm T. Sexton. Manual confirmation at 10:19. Room isolated at 10:23. Product removed from projected capacity at 10:38. Utility power failed at 10:44. Mark examined the control panel. "Cause? Burned exhaust relay. I have not confirmed whether the motor increased the load. Why not replace the relay? If the motor is drawing excessive current, it could burn the replacement. So the room remains down until the load is tested." Eleanor pointed toward the blocks. "What happens to this crop?" "It stays isolated. If morphology and quality do not return within specification, it is destroyed. That is 260 pounds. Expected product." Caleb said, "Not approved product." Martin stood behind the group. He had spent years listening to farmers describe what they hoped a crop might produce. Caleb had just removed 260 pounds from his own forecast because the product had not earned the number. Mark selected a code from a crate harvested the previous day. "Trace this." Caleb found the file. Spawn lot 0441. Straw from Miller Farm. Delivered March 8th. Pasteurization cycle P226. Inoculated March 10th. Fruited in room 1. Harvested April 21st. Packed by Caleb Hale. Mark selected another code. Then 3 more. One record contained a note written in red ink. Yield reduced operator error. Mark looked up. "Who was the operator?" "I was." "What did you do?" "I shortened the cooling period because I was behind schedule. The substrate temperature was still above target when I inoculated." "You recorded your own error?" "It was the cause." You did not sell the affected product? No. Why keep the record? So the contamination rate is real? Eleanor glanced toward Martin. Martin looked at the floor. The inspection continued for 4 hours. Water handling, worker movement, cleaning schedules, cold storage, pest control, generator logs, delivery contingencies. Mark inspected payroll training records and noticed one employee had failed a sanitation evaluation during the second week. Why was he allowed to work after failing? He was reassigned to raw material handling and retrained. Why not remove the failed record? Because he failed. Did he pass later? 2 supervised evaluations. Mark closed the file. At noon, Eleanor closed her notebook. You have demonstrated traceability, she said. Caleb waited. You have not demonstrated full backup production. I can. Here? No. He led them back to the garage. When the door rolled upward, warm light fell across the old stainless steel milk cooler. Martin recognized it immediately. The dent remained on the left side. The dairy label had nearly disappeared. Eleanor walked around it. This is your backup pasteurization system? Yes. Mark opened the lid. The interior was clean. Caleb showed them the heating elements, manual valves, calibration records, and probes. If automation fails at the hatchery, Mark asked, how much can this handle? 3 emergency cycles a day, without reducing hold time. What controls circulation? I do. That is not automation. No. What happens if you are unavailable? Caleb pointed toward a laminated procedure on the wall. 2 operators are trained. Each has completed 3 supervised cycles. Mark selected several backup records. 27 completed tests. Not estimates. Not promises. Tests. Eleanor looked at the cooler. What did this originally cost? $65. 65 at the foreclosure auction. A farmer from the county tour stepped closer and touched the dented steel. This is the same cooler? Before Caleb could answer, Martin spoke. It is. The room became quiet. Years earlier, Martin had called it the only piece of farming Caleb could still afford. Now he was the one confirming that the object had survived. Caleb filled the tank, placed probes at 3 depths, and started the heating system. For the next hour, Mark watched the temperatures rise and stabilize. The system completed the required hold period. Caleb demonstrated how emergency cycles from the garage could support production, while Room 2 remained offline. Mark entered the figures into a calculator. Eleanor looked at Caleb. If Room 2 stays down for a week, 812 pounds from the other rooms. If this backup performs, 940. You would still miss contract volume. For 1 week. What would you tell us? The truth before you scheduled your customers around a number I could not deliver. Eleanor placed the contract on the cooler lid. She turned toward the people in the garage. I want everyone here to understand what North River is purchasing. Martin remained near the door. We are not buying a rare mushroom. Eleanor said, we are not paying for the size of this garage. She rested a hand on the old cooler. And we are not paying $1 million for a tank. She opened Caleb's records. We are paying for documented sanitation, lot traceability, delivery discipline, backup capacity, and a grower who removes bad product from his own forecast before a buyer has to ask. She found one of the earliest pages, contamination, 58%. Then she turned to the most recent quarter, contamination, 8%. I can purchase shelving in a week, she said. I can purchase a cooler in a day. She closed the book. I cannot purchase the years he spent learning what fails. Eleanor looked around the garage. The mushrooms grown in this building did not become worth $1 million by themselves. She placed her hand on the ledger. The production system he built inside this garage became capable of carrying $1 million agreement. The larger facility is a copy of what was proven here. She placed a pen on the contract. I came here to buy mushrooms. What North River needs is the time already built into this system. Then she signed. The agreement required a minimum purchase of 1,050 pounds a week at an average contracted price of $6.60 per pound for 36 months. Minimum value, $1. Lingba Yi. Ling ba ling. The money would not arrive in one check. Caleb still had to grow, harvest, pack, and deliver the product every week. North River could reject mushrooms outside specification. Repeated failures could end the agreement. It was not a gift. It was not a miracle. It was a commercial obligation worth more than $1 million. Earned one delivery at a time. 3 months later, the first full contracted shipment left Hale Ridge mushrooms. 2 refrigerated trucks backed toward the loading area. Workers carried labeled crates from the cold room. Each crate showed a production code that could be traced to its spawn lot. Substrata. Room. Harvest date. And packer. A county agricultural tour stood along the gravel lot. Several farmers who had once laughed at the fungus garage watched the trucks fill. Earl Mason, who had joked about Caleb's ruined bags, removed his cap. "You still have the number for that buyer?" Caleb handed him Eleanor's business card. "What are you growing?" Caleb asked. "Herbs. Maybe specialty greens. Keep your delivery records." Earl nodded. No one applauded. No one needed to. The people who had once asked whether mushrooms grown in a garage counted as farming were now asking how to build operations buyers could trust. The truck doors closed. Hale Ridge Mushrooms was painted across the sides. The drivers pulled onto the county road. For several miles, the route followed the boundary of the old Hale farm. Caleb did not follow the trucks to watch them pass the house. He returned to the production room. The next delivery was 7 days away. Martin came to the garage alone 2 weeks later. He was not wearing a suit. Caleb was cleaning the old milk cooler when Martin entered. "I should have called first," Martin said. "You are here now." Martin looked at the shelves. The garage remained active as a culture room, testing space, an emergency production site. "I thought acreage was the proof that a man was farming," Martin said. Caleb continued rinsing the tank. Martin waited. "I also used your father's failure to explain yours before you had one." Caleb shut off the water. "The foreclosure was business." Martin nodded. "What you said about him was a choice." "Yes." The answer came quietly. Martin looked toward Thomas Hale's ledger. "My father believed the bank's job was to understand how a farm worked before deciding what it was worth. And you?" "I believe the balance sheet told me enough. It told you about the debt. It did not tell me what you could build." Martin removed a folded document from his coat. The County Agricultural Board was forming a panel to review financing requests from small and non-traditional farm businesses. They wanted Caleb to serve. Martin did not offer a loan. He did not ask Caleb to transfer his accounts to Ridge County Bank. He did not pretend the past could be repaired with a handshake. "I understand if you decline," he said. Caleb read the document. What would the panel measure? Business plans? Contracts, operating records, market risk, and collateral. Who defines agriculture? The board. Then change that first. Martin waited. Caleb pointed toward the production ledgers. Measure the operation before you measure the acreage. I can put that in the charter. Put it in the scoring. A month later, Caleb joined the panel. The first disputed application came from a widow named Marlene Price, who wanted to convert an unused packing shed into a controlled environment microgreens business. One board member looked at her application. She owns less than 2 acres. Martin glanced toward Caleb. Then he reopened the operating records. Then measure the operation, he said. Marlene did not receive automatic approval. She still had to prove her market, sanitation plan, costs, and ability to repay. But she was no longer rejected because her farm did not look like the farms the board already understood. That was Martin's consequence. He did not lose the bank. He did not lose his home. He lost the certainty that had once allowed him to judge people before their records were read. Caleb never bought back all 142 acres of Hale Farm. The farmhouse was renovated by another family. The dairy barn became a storage building. Most of the land remained under different ownership. 3 years after signing the North River Agreement, Caleb purchased 22 acres in another valley, using retained earnings for the down payment. He did not mortgage the garage, but he kept the original building. It became the training and testing center for Hale Ridge mushrooms. New growers learned sanitation there. Employees practiced emergency pasteurization cycles with the old milk cooler. Small batches were tested before entering commercial production. On one wall, Caleb placed his father's dairy ledger inside a simple glass case. The book remained open to the underlined sentence, "What you don't measure will eventually own you." Below it, the first page showed contamination, 58%. Commercial yield, failure, cause unknown. The final page showed contamination, 8%. On-time delivery, 6%. Traceability tests passed, 5 of 5. Caleb never hid the first page. Without it, the last page meant nothing. Years later, a young grower visiting the garage asked whether Thomas Hale had left Caleb the secret to building the mushroom business. Caleb looked at the old dairy ledger. "My father did not leave me a successful farm," he said. "He left me honest records of an unsuccessful one." The young man waited. Caleb closed the production book in front of him. That was more useful than a lie. The bank had taken the fields. It had taken the barns. It had taken the farmhouse carrying his father's name, but it had left Caleb one garage, one failed milk cooler, and the habit of writing down the truth. That turned out to be enough.